Welcome. My name is Joost Wagner. I'm going to be your moderator today. Welcome to the Malaria Week 2020. And today's session is Sustaining Health Financing in a Time of Crisis. So let me begin by introducing our two co-chairs for today's event. We have Dr. Peter Coley, the coordinator for Health Policy and Service Design Unit at the World Health Organization at the Western Pacific Regional Office based in Manila. And our other co-chair is Dr. Susie Pereira, the Deputy Director General for Public Health Services at the Ministry of Health, Government of Sri Lanka. We are also very pleased to count on the participation of Dr. Indu Bhushan. Dr. Indu Bhushan is the CEO of Ayushman Bharat, the world's ambitious public health insurance scheme with ambitions to cover 500 million people in India with access to healthcare. Thank you for joining us. And before I hand over to the co-chairs, allow me to welcome Lisa Robbins. She's the vice chair of the APLMA board, and she will give us some introductory remarks. Lisa, over to you.
Great. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to welcome all of you. And thank you to our speakers, co-chairs of this session, and to APLMA and everyone who participates to discuss this important topic. As you might know from my background, I'm actually in finance. I'm a banker. And the part of the bank that I'm responsible for supports trade flows. It supports payments. And in that vein, we touch the real economy. And I've lived all over Asia as a child and an adult. And so when I think of these issues, it's with personal interest, as well as a professional interest, that I'm interested in ensuring that we eradicate malaria in the timeframe that we agreed. Well, we're all in the midst of COVID right now, and we all see it upfront and personal. What's happened to economies, families, and the well-being of our communities. And we're all doing a lot of introspection about what will make our world better on a sustainable basis. So today's session is really about a call to action for sustainable finance that will enable the eradication of malaria. Without a sustainable focus, we find that diseases will rear their ugly heads again, as they have. Well, with regard to malaria, we have reached a really critical juncture in the fight against malaria here in APAC. Here are the facts. 85% increase in funding, fueled primarily by domestic focus. This represents a threefold increase in spend since 2012. And the corollary to that, the result, 42% reduction in cases since 2010 in this region. Sustained funding and focus have paid results. Sadly, the opposite is also true. Where funding has tapered off or has been insufficient, we witness a resurgence of malaria. And we know that no matter what sector we operate in, you need to be a team to be successful. And I know I'm speaking perhaps like a banker here, but what we find is collaboration and action have to act in tandem, because you can't get away from the law of physics, and that water seeks its lowest level, its own level, which is the lowest level. Said in a different way, we're only as strong as our weakest link. Countries must work together. We must work together. As long as malaria is present anywhere, we risk resurgence. Well, COVID presents us with some additional challenges. COVID is an urban and rural problem, impacting people no matter where they sit on the planet. Governments were surprised and challenged, and that those challenges have impacted funding, both private and public budgets. So with malaria, which impacts, a resurgence would impact the poorest and most vulnerable amongst us, we really need to keep our eye on the ball. The discussion needs to be about eradication and about preparedness. we need to find a way to align our goals for COVID and pandemic preparedness with our goals for malaria and stay focused. Couple more points. This session basically is an important session. I see it as a call to action. It will feed into the discussion on Friday at the senior officials meeting and help inform our direction for the next few years. It's a call for sustained finance, sustained political commitment, and a call to work together for pandemic preparedness while keeping ourselves focused on malaria eradication goals. So I'm delighted to stay to hear what our panelists will say. I'm delighted that we have such esteemed speakers. And I'm very excited for what APLMA is doing and what we'll do to support this community as we move forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lisa Robbins, for these remarks. Lisa Robbins, for the people who came late, she's a vice chair of the APLMA board. And thank you for highlighting the importance of financing also for our important work. So before I hand over to the co-chairs, I just wanted to remind all participants that please ensure that your full name is shown. So rename yourself on Zoom that we can read your full name. Videos, we request you to keep them off as long as you're not a speaker. And you can make heavy use of our chat box, write insights and comments while the session is going on. So I have now the pleasure to hand over to Peter Corley and Susie Pereira, our two chairs for today's session. Over to you.
Thank you, Joss. This is Peter Cowley. I'm the coordinator of the Health Policy and Service Design Unit at the Western Pacific Regional Office of the World Health Organization. My background is I'm both a physician and a health economist, and I couldn't make my mind up, so decided to do both of them. They, much to the chagrin of my mother, who still thinks that I'm a practicing physician. If I may, just for a moment, speak to some more financial aspects of what's occurring in the COVID-19 space, which may not be apparent to everyone. But firstly, I'd like to thank you, Jost, and to thank the conference organizers as well as my co-host. It's indeed a pleasure to be here, and my only hope is that next year the meeting will be live and I will have the chance to meet everyone in person. I too would like to thank my fellow panelists and welcome you to this event. While many in the audience are either personally or professionally aware of the impact COVID-19 has on one's well-being, the economic impact of COVID-19 on government revenue and family pocketbooks may not be so well known. We see many figures in the paper about reductions in GDP forecast, but the effects of these in particular on government revenue and therefore on government programs, including funding for line ministries, including the Ministry of Health, are predicted to be quite severe in many countries. While many countries in Asia have previously suffered economic consequences as a result of the currency crisis in 1998 and the global economic crisis of 2008, this crisis is much worse. It's different, and I'll potentially explain some of the aspects of how this crisis is different a bit later. It's not only the Ministry of Health budgets that are under threat due to decreased government revenue, that in itself is a result of the economic, in itself is a result of COVID-19 and the measures that have been introduced to reduce the effects of COVID-19. But households are suffering. Many have lost their job. Many informal traders have lost sources of revenue. And we're beginning to predict and see early signs of increases in poverty rates secondary to the COVID-19 and again, some of the revenue diminishing aspects of some of the control measures that are associated with COVID-19. We all know that COVID-19 induced economic crisis will last forever, but it's going to require some very tough budgetary and fiscal stabilization decisions in the short and the possible medium-term horizon. In other words, many budgets, including malaria budgets, are going to be under threat. in many countries because of these fiscal shortfalls that are a result of decreased revenue, which in itself is a result of COVID-19. This is going to require some very tough decisions, but these tough decisions must recognize that tremendous progress has been made against malaria in the Asia Pacific region. We cannot let this progress be halted or even reversed because there is not adequate malaria funding. And I repeat this because it's so important. We cannot let this progress be halted or even reversed if adequate malaria funding is not provided. We know what will happen. It's been well documented what will happen to malarial incidence rates if in fact budgets are cut for malaria. It's well established. It's happened in a few countries, and some of my co-presenters will describe such. For many of you, these challenges are not new, and I'm not saying things that are groundbreaking. To some, we tend to overlook that government revenue depends on economic activity through income tax, value-added tax, import tax, licensure fees, et cetera. And economic activity has reduced. We all know that. But the other thing that I'd like to stress once again is that many households are under threat because of this reduced economic activity as well. And this is certainly no time to put an increased burden on households and with excessive health expenditures, especially those related to communicable diseases such as malaria. I'm excited, and I know that many are, to learn more about this interface between finance and health. And once again, I'd like to thank you very much for being with us today. And I very much encourage you during your breakout groups to be active, have your voice heard. And I know that myself and fellow presenters and fellow organizers, no question, the only stupid question is a question that's never asked. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peter Corley. And we're going to talk more with you about sustaining health financing in the times of crisis in a moment. I'm handing over to our second co-chair for today, Dr. Susi Pereira from the government of Sri Lanka. Dr. Susi, you have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Joss. It's indeed a pleasure for me to co-host this together with Aparma and with Dr. Peter Cowley from WHO. I join my fellow panelists in welcoming you all to this event. Actually, it's a very, very decisive moment where some of our countries have made significant progress in the fight against malaria. But as previously said, we must face the reality now. We are in uncertain times, and we have to deal with a combined economic crisis where some critical decisions have to be made by the governments, respective governments. And with COVID-19 taking an exceptionally heavy toll on people's lives, obviously the decision is going to tip to a different side. But we really cannot ignore the other communicable diseases. And I'm sure there will be other communicable diseases also competing with malaria. So the negative impact is going to disrupt funding for health services for other life-threatening diseases. So there is a lot of calculations to be made, but the calculations sometimes are not really understood by the decision makers themselves. So here are in this direction, it's important to understand how we are going to lobby for this kind of investments to come. So I think this event is a very important one, and it's a chance to review the impact of COVID-19 on government revenues, but importantly, to come up with strategies in sustaining the finances and making the money last longer, and where we can put it aptly for countries' development in such where malaria will play a greater role. So for the Sri Lankan situation, I think I'm given time for that, and I think I will explain a little bit, because we faced a huge challenge. Sometimes when you look back, did we do it right? But we don't want to do it wrong the next time. So this is the what I would like to highlight. So I think we all need to actively participate in the breakout session, and certainly everyone's views are critical. So let me thank you again for being with us here today. Over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Susie. Yes, we are going to talk about Sri Lanka a little bit more in a moment. However, I would like quickly to show the objectives for today's session. My colleagues will display them on your screen, and maybe I will say a word about the flow. So as you can see, we have 4 objectives. I'm not going to read them out to you, but we very much want to discuss the potential impact of COVID-19 on our government revenues and budgets, and of course, discuss how we can sustain financing in these critical times. And as you have already heard from Lisa, these recommendations will feed into the senior officials meeting on Friday. So everything we capture, and we have a couple of people having this task to capture everything what is said and what is maybe also in the chat box, will feed into our senior officials meeting on Friday. We will distill some key messages for that meeting. So the flow, as you have also heard from Susie, that we are actually having a breakout. So we're gonna continue in a moment with a short talk show on sustaining health financing in a time of crisis. I will speak again with Peter. I will speak again with Dr. Susie, and also with the CEO of Ayushman Bharat and the National Health Authority in Bhushan. And then we're gonna have a short break, and we're going into breakouts of equally sized groups so that everybody has a fair chance to speak. And we're gonna discuss 2-3 critical questions with you. And then we're gonna meet one more time in the plenary, and we try to distill some messages from these different groups. And that's it for today. So that's the plan for the next 1 hour, 40 minutes. So hopefully you can stay with us, and please be aware the breakouts are very interesting, and hopefully you can all join. So we're gonna show now a small video for 2 minutes that highlights the importance of sustainable financing for malaria elimination. So I would like to request our colleagues to play the video now. So thank you very much for showing the video. Ending malaria is a smart investment. And on the other hand, we have heard from Peter Corley already that the budgets are under threat. So we have a small poll for you. And this is interesting. We have two polls, and the first one we are going to show now is only for government officials. So if you are a government official, please check yourself. Are you a government official? Then you are invited to answer that question. If you're not a government official, hold your horses. We are having a second poll for everybody who's working in other organizations. So only government officials, you are called upon. Please look at the screen. There is a questionnaire for you. And the question is, compared to 2019, how is COVID-19 impacting the health budget in your country? So is it a modest budget cut, less than 10%? Is it a drastic cut, no changes, or even maybe the budget increased, or maybe you are not really aware because it's not your area of expertise or involvement. So I give you another 20 seconds. Okay, so if you're a government official, please let us know. This is, of course, not a real scientific method, but it gives us an indication. And I can already see as a moderator that many people face cuts. Okay, so maybe we end this poll and maybe show the results for a second. So I understand you can see the results now, and just with a quick look, about half already know that they are facing budget cuts, some more than 10%, some more than less percent. A few people, one person actually said the budget increased, and 40% that they don't know yet. So let us go straight into the second poll. And this time I would call upon all the other participants, especially grant makers, technical agencies, NGOs, so people who also have some relation to the health budget in your country. So I think this was not the right one. Can we poll number 2? Okay, I think, yes, here we go. So question for participants, compared to 2019, is your organization experiencing budget cuts for health programs because of dwindling resources? And some of you will probably say, I don't even have a budget for my coffee this week. So it's not a question that is relevant for me because it's not your area. But everybody else, please, you are invited to answer that question. It's anonymous. And so I give you 20 seconds and okay, another 10. Okay, so can we show the results? So as you can see that exactly one third of all the responses say there's a major budget cut, more than 10%. And so that's quite dramatic, I think, for many organizations. But some also say there are no changes or even the budget increased. So maybe I will later talk to our panelists a little bit more about that. Thank you very much to our team for showing the poll. And let's go straight into the discussion on sustainable health financing in times of crisis. Let's talk about the impact of COVID-19 on government revenues and health budget a little bit more. So I would like to call upon Peter Corley again and ask him, as in your role at the WHO, you can have a very good overview what is happening in Asia and the Pacific. So are you seeing also any important trends and impact of COVID-19 on government's revenues and health budgets in the regions? And maybe were you surprised by the poll results?
Thank you, Jost. And again, this is an interesting line of work, and many others, including and obviously the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, as well as the Asian Development Bank, are partners that we work with in investigating some of the decreases in government revenue and some of the policies, the macroeconomic policies associated thereupon. I tried to get a few slides together, just thinking through this a little bit. And the first one is, and I'd mentioned this earlier, where are we with this particular economic crisis compared to ones in recent memory? And again, this is for the Asia Pacific region. This one's deeper. As you can see, this is the per capita GDP growth. In most countries in Asia and the Pacific, things were humming along quite nicely. This and something else that should be mentioned about this crisis is it was not a problem with the financial markets. It's not a problem with trade. This crisis is pretty much solely based on the effects of COVID-19. Again, I just wanted to reiterate there was nothing wrong with the markets, as opposed to the crisis in Asian, the currency crisis in 1998, as well as the subprime mortgage market induced crisis of 2008, where there was a problem with the financial markets. And the reason why I mention this is in terms of the recovery. The recovery, when it's in the financial markets, tends to be a bit longer than we suspect it would be for the COVID-19. Again, COVID-19 is the first time in a long time where it's been a health-induced crisis. There were some effects from the Spanish flu, but it's nowhere near what we're seeing now. It's deeper. You can see the reductions, in the GDP growth. For many countries, they're not going to be in positive territory for this year. Many countries, the majority of countries, where they were predicted to do so. And you will see that the shape of the curve, one refers to it as, you hear about it a lot, the V shape, as you can see furthest to the right here. How wide will this V-shaped curve be? People are beginning to talk about now the Nike swoosh curve, where it will be the recovery, the right-hand bit of the V-shaped curve, which is in itself on the right-hand bit of this slide, may be more towards the horizontal. The end result is the longer the lockdowns go on, the more the risk to the actual business cycle. In terms of people just stop shopping. They stop because they get used to not having to shop. So again, we're still hoping for a rapid recovery. But in the longer it goes on, the more that you may see some fundamental changes to the economy, which may affect the shape of the recovery curve. But going to the next slide, how has this affected government revenue? As you can see, we call this the revenue shock. When there's less economic activity, there's just less VAT, there's less income tax, there's less import tax, one can imagine. And it's quite significant. As a percent of GDP, we see in the pre-crisis levels, and this has been separated into the income status of the country on the lower part of the table and the upper part of the table and geographical distribution. Don't get too bothered by the complexity of the amount of numbers. The end result is, if you look at the difference, which is column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, column 6, you will see overall for the Asian and the Pacific region, in terms of general government revenue, there's a decline in 4% as a percent of GDP. This is significant. And it is going from a pre-crisis level of 37.4% of GDP to a post-crisis level of 33.3%. Again, the takeaway message is that it's a significant decrease in government revenue. And one could say, around 4% in general across all economies. An interesting aspect to this, you will see that some of the higher income countries, some of the lower income countries don't suffer as much. And why is that? That's mainly because of the composition of the economy of the country. In particular, countries that have had that are service-based economies, that are economies that are based on remittances, economies that are based on tourism, in particular the Pacific Island countries have taken a particular hit. And also those economies which are oil producing because of the collapse in oil and gas prices. So the take home is it's significant what the government revenue drop is and will be for the next few months. And of particular note are countries that are high service-based economies, economies that are heavily involved with remittances, tourism, and international trade, as well as the oil and gas sector. Next slide, please. So that's the revenue shock one refers to. Now, the other side of the coin is the expenditure shock. Government expenses have shot up in most countries. And the reason why they have shot up is not because necessarily health. In many countries, it's for macroeconomic stabilization efforts. It is in stabilizing some of the borrowing markets, stabilizing loans, stabilizing access to credit. In certain countries, it's actually covering people who've lost their jobs. It is in covering, at times, health insurance contributions. Some countries have delayed tax, income tax implementation. It's significant. And you can see here, again, as a percent of GDP, what government expenditures, what the picture looks like. And for all Asia and the Pacific, it's an increase of 3.5%. So when you put the two together, you put government revenue as a percent of GDP on average has gone down 4.1%, yet the expenses have gone up 3.5%. All of us are involved in household finances, and when you have less money coming in and more money going out, what happens? This is called a deficit. And this fiscal deficit in many countries in the region has doubled. Most countries have a fiscal deficit. Most governments have a fiscal deficit. They run it every year as a percent of the economy and a percent of the GDP. But this deficit, which is in effect the difference between revenue and expenditure, has doubled and more in many countries. And what does a government do in order to cover this deficit? It often borrows, and it borrows more. Many countries were in okay fiscal shape before this crisis. Some were not. Some were in much poorer fiscal shape, and some were already had an overextended, one may say, access to loans. And now they need even more loans to cover this deficit. Certain countries in the region are actually approaching default. Again, I don't want to paint an overly grim picture, but the picture is that government revenue has declined and expenditures have gone up. Again, this is not necessarily because of health expenditures. In most cases, health expenditures were dwarfed by macroeconomic stabilization expenditures. And governments have to turn to the debt market. We are seeing, and we will predict, we're working with the bank and others, and there will be an increase in debt load in the short to medium term. So again, it's not a pretty picture, Joss, but I just wanted to be realistic about it. Over.
Yeah, Peter. Good. Let me combine my two questions I had for you, and maybe you can answer them in the next 3-4 minutes. I mean, you painted, yes, a pretty grim picture, but are there any noteworthy revenue raising on budget allocation practices used in the region to address the fiscal shortfalls from COVID-19? And what fiscal instruments can be used to ensure
Sure.
adequate funding for malaria during COVID-19 times? So I combine my two questions. Over to
Sure.
you.
Sure. You know, some have talked about increasing NCD taxation rates. You know, that from a fiscal point of view, it may not add that much to revenue, but at least you're going to, you know, in the medium to long term, decrease some expenditures associated with NCDs. You know, many have been calling for now is the time for increased NCD taxation. What governments tend to do is they will, you know, they enter in what's called counter-cyclical funding. And it seems a bit odd, but what they do is that they will pour it on. They will, you know, try and keep the economy stimulated. But this counter-cyclical funding comes from, the money has to come from somewhere, and often it's debt fueled. So countries will try that if they can. Some countries don't have access to credit and able to do that. Some of the smaller states, and those are the states that have had more trouble. More specifically, if I could just turn to, I think I had a slide or two just about what governments can do. You know, sometimes, you know, governments, if they had increased reserves, they can meet some of these expenditures. For most countries, the reserves that they've had for pandemic preparedness, which have been burnt through. And again, they have to turn to the debt market. Another problem with some of the debt market is that the economic growth in Asia was, as you can, we will see in the first slide, was much stronger prior to the 2008 crisis than it was prior to this crisis. And that influences your access to the debt markets. What governments will do, it will delay capital spending will be one of the first things it will do. And it will start to do some budget modification procedures for stuff describe in just a minute. It will look for efficiencies. Ministry of Finance will be looking for efficiency in spending. And this is the point that I really, really, really want to make. Is that ministries of finance will have very sharp eyes, very, very sharp eyes, because they are in a difficult fiscal situation, and they will be looking very hard for efficiencies, and they will be looking very hard at medium-term outputs, what are called medium-term outputs. And, you know, unfortunately, we're already starting to see the effects of this, that we're starting to see cash flow problems in certain countries, and we're already beginning to see problems in underfunding of critical programs. It's happening. And to answer your question, whether this is something that is unexpected, the survey results, absolutely not. I mean, it's math. It's just math, the budget. And this is difficult. If I could just go to the last slide, and I'll get out of this conversation. And there's something just wanted to highlight. You know, what can we do in terms of malaria? And again, I wanted to just, you know, echo what Dr. Pereira had mentioned. It isn't just malaria, it's communicable disease. We've got to be proactive. We've got to make exceptions for health. We've got to try and make exceptions for health in terms of budget cuts. And for many that are working on a calendar year budget, these discussions will be going on right now in budget discussions. Got to have health declared a priority sector. The momentum is behind us, and we've got to have malaria declared a priority as a health subsector. Again, I'm looking forward to hearing Dr. Pereira and others. We know what will happen if malaria budget cuts occur. Malaria comes back. It's pretty simple. You know, malaria incidence starts to rise. We need to get this in front of the conversation. A couple of other things that are important. The Ministry of Finance will start to more than likely increase the use of what are called virements, which is, you know, administrative transfers of budgets from one part to another, and they'll be using supplemental budgets in certain countries. They need the flexibility. Ministry of Finance need flexibility because they don't know what their revenue is going to be in the forthcoming years. This flexibility is expressed in these virements as well as these supplemental budgets. They will use this, and they will say to malaria and to health more than likely, oh, you know, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it earlier on in the year. we will fund you with supplemental budgets, or we'll fund you with these virulence later. Try and avoid that, because that is not guaranteed. Malaria needs to make its case, and health needs to make its case that it's a priority sector, and it needs to have its funding already allocated, not based on virulence or based on supplemental budgets. Perhaps as important is that, malaria programs need to be clear and transparent and holistic in terms of transition financing with bilateral and multilateral partners. Everybody knows that budgets are under threat. It will not last forever, but we certainly don't want malaria to fall into a short-term funding difficulty, which will cause malaria incidence to go up, because eradicating malaria is a medium-term picture, and we want to make certain that the Ministry of Finance realizes that it is a medium-term picture. The economic crisis will go away, but if we take our foot off the gas, malaria will come back, and it will be more expensive next time to deal with it.
Okay.
And last one is there's some interesting discussions around some policy-based lending as well as debt renegotiation. And these are just areas that health as well as malaria can get in front of. There's going to be different types of public financial management procedures going forward. I'd mentioned the increased use of virulence as well as supplemental budgets, but we're going to start to see some debt renegotiation for reasons I'd mentioned before. And again, these are opportunities for malaria to show how important it is to keep the funding. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this interesting insights on malaria funding. However, let's move on. And as you know, our co-chair works for the government of Sri Lanka. And let's talk for a moment about Sri Lanka's experience. So, Susie, Sri Lanka was certified as malaria-free in 2016, and it was hailed as an incredible achievement. However, Sri Lanka was close to eliminate malaria already in 1963, before it resurged and peaked at 450,000 cases in 1969, my birth year actually. So what can we learn from Sri Lanka's story?
Thank you, Just. Yes, Sri Lanka achieved the status of malaria elimination in 2016 with no local transmission being reported since 2012. But, once bitten in the 1960s, we have to be many times shy, considering that the stakes would be very high if our country has to deal with resurgence of malaria at this point. In the early 1960s, as you said, we reached the level of elimination, but we relaxed very soon after. We didn't really pay the attention to surveillance, which obviously needed the resources. So the result of not investing, which means investing in a structured program, emphasizing the surveillance, we went into the epidemic situation, and it's only after 50 years that we reached the elimination levels again in 2012, and we were declared that we had eliminated malaria in only 2016. So the penalty was very, very high. Of course, we are supported by the Global Fund, which was in project mode support to the program for many years. Now, it's a good strategy to move from project mode support to budget support, which we have done now. Now, this indicates when we are moving from project mode to budget support, that the government recognizes the magnitude of financing that needs to come with it. Right? So it's estimated that for every Sri Lankan, we are 21 million in the country, an investment of something like 60 rupees per capita is needed to prevent incurring a cost of 600 rupees per capita if resurgence occurs. So that's really a return of investment something like tenfold. Well, there are other analyses which have been done by Shweta R. and Avanche et al., published in the American Journal of Tropical Medicine. And they say that it's really a return on investment of 13-fold. This is analysis done on the reintroduction of malaria in Sri Lanka. Now, the challenge is how the government will keep the allocation for malaria even after the Global Fund ceases the budget support. Now, the good thing in our country is that we have the public health architecture. Actually, that's what's actually helping us even now in the COVID response. And there's a high commitment malaria surveillance activities. So that has been built with all the support that we have got. And we have invested in that architecture. So surveillance is actually a strong point. And there are many other parallel investments to further strengthen surveillance activities in the country. So that's a very strong point. Like now, it's not only surveillance for malaria, but the other integrated surveillance functions are contributing to this. So some of the current work that I would like to mention is harmonizing the migration health policy with prevention of imported malaria through the mandatory inbound health assessment for resident visa applicants, which happens within 1 month of people coming into the country. So those tested positive are linked with the malaria program for treatment and follow-up. I'm trying to explain how we have built other integrated approaches so that we could deal with making best use of the investments. So the inbound health assessment is not only for malaria. It's being done as public health protection for TB, HIV, filariasis, and also any positives are all linked for any of these programs for the respective control programs for treatment and follow-up. And this is the country's public health protection. Now, in the COVID-19 response also, we had malaria control activities. There was mandatory testing for those coming into the country from malaria prevalent countries. Actually, we detected several when they were under quarantine. So that's another way that we looked at it. We didn't dwindle in the malaria response, rather the keeping the country free from malaria. Now, the National Malaria Control Program very closely links up with the provincial health ministries together with the regional malaria officers and keeps very close watch at the different points of entry. So actually you can see that we learned that from the penalty we paid in relaxing, and we have tried a lot of things to integrate and build a really health systems response. So the question is difficult actually, you know, like we are facing a difficult time maintaining this, but the fact that we have been integrating it into so many other things helps the situation. So we still need the money for it. We still need it. So I would like to explain further on how we're doing it.
So we have another 2 minutes, Dr. Pereira. Maybe can you just
so actually now how do we keep the priorities going? Now if you see the government priorities keep on changing, right? So it's actually up to the health to advocate with each government prospectively. Governments will come and go, but keeping the momentum for to give money for malaria is really a matter of health advocacy, right? So So there are many, many ways that this happens actually. Actually, even the continuous attendance of our ministers of health at World Health Assemblies and the global health diplomacy plays a role in understanding what's happening in other countries. And actually, the WHO SIA region, we have a flagship area dedicated for this, and this also keeps a very prompt, the political advocacy here also is strong because there is this commitment from the ministers for this. Now, actually, for Sri Lanka, for health, the commitment has been there, right? But the issue is which program gets priority, right? So we do have, as I mentioned earlier, competing interests for communicable diseases, and dengue fever is very high on the card. So there is a lot of competing interests for the finance that goes for dengue at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so we have actually gone through a stage previously where budget allocations were strictly made on morbidity, mortality data, and now what we are trying is the economic case. It's being highlighted more on maintaining the elimination status, and if not, what happens? So the economic case is becoming more important right now because that we have eliminated it. So people in finance ministries, actually the seniors, can still remember the epidemic and the funds that were taken up to control malaria. Now, the challenge is when those of us, who knew what malaria is, who have treated and we have experienced now, and the finance ministries also have seen, because they have also faced this, high-level politicians knew malaria, but when they're not there, when we are not there, what happens? So that's going to be an obvious challenge for future national level program managers, not knowing how challenging it is to control malaria and not having seen a single patient too. So future national program managers, we are going to, because they will not really emotionally be related to this. So we need to now think of a strategy until the whole world has got rid of it, where countries can rejuvenate their experience to manage all aspects of malaria control with a real sense of feel for it. So that is also coming into the picture right now. We are really facing this also, this challenge. So the economic case is really important at this moment, and global health to see that program management, we program managers also see what malaria is and they get some time to really experience this. This is also important.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pereira, for sharing the Sri Lanka experience. And Dr. Indu Bhushan has been patiently waiting. And thank you so very much for your time, Dr. Bhushan. I know how busy you are. And for people who came late, Dr. Bhushan is the CEO of Ayushman Bharat, the world's most ambitious public health insurance scheme. I'm very fascinated by what you are trying to achieve in India. So 500 million people to get access to healthcare. So Dr. Bhushan, the world economy is experiencing an unprecedented recession. At the same time, we know that if we reduce funding for health, it will have a devastating impact. Or let me quote actually Dr. Suzanne Roth, who is actually in this meeting and will actually moderate a breakout. She said, health is not everything, but without health, there is nothing. So how do we cut through the COVID-19 noise to ensure increased or sustained financing for health in a period of financial crisis? And what is, in your opinion, actually a convincing argument? How do we convince the Ministry of Finance to prioritize its investment in time of reduced governments? I throw all the questions to you at once because I know you have limited time. Dr. Bhushan, looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to this forum, for sharing my views. Now, convincing ministries of finance for providing more funding for health has been something that I've been struggling with for last 30 years almost. Before I was asked to head this mission and this scheme, I was working with the Asian Development Bank, and I joined ADB in 1997, about 23 years ago. And my first job, which was given to me, was to go and convince the government of Sri Lanka in a what we call country programming mission to borrow for health sector. And I must say that I was at the time was prepared with all analysis numbers that investing in health has so much payoff. $1 spent on health will give back $8 or $9, and human capital is one of the major investment that or most profitable investment that countries can make. I had numbers from studies in South Asia and around the world. I had also shown that if all the East Asian countries, we used to call them, of course, tigers, they had actually reduced infant mortality and gained a lot in terms of health before they took off. It was not that their economies grew and that's why health was better, but because they had good health indicator, that's why economies grew. But I must say that when I presented all these, I was a big failure. I was told in no uncertain term that, we want to borrow for something that we can show and see, and that can improve the economy. And once the economy improves, we'll have more taxes, and those taxes can be put in sectors like health. So we want to borrow hard money for hard sectors, and there should be soft money. If you have grants, we can take for health sector. All this argument that health investment in health is an investment in welfare rather than productive investment has been the concept for a long time. But of course, the more research has continuously shown that actually reducing poverty, reducing inequality, improving gender welfare are not for welfare, but actually they're for improving economy. And there is a very persuasive research and study from IMF which shows that inequalities, any kind of inequalities, are bad for growth. If with the unequal societies, you can actually reach high growth, but you can't sustain them, because unless all sections of society are working together and providing their contribution to society, you really can't have a high level of growth. So that dichotomy between hard sector, soft sector, hard sector being more better for economy, I think that's a false dichotomy, and one has to get out of that. But convincing governments have been difficult. And what I found in my my experience with the world ADB was that 4 factors. One, that disruptive things, shocks, help. And for example, when SARS happened, and after SARS, investment in health sector in all East Asian countries, especially China, went up in a big way. So any disruption, any shock helps. Similarly, in Vietnam, where I was working, there was a big scandal where they found that there was some chemicals in pho, which is the staple diet of Vietnamese, and the focus on food safety and investment in food safety went up because of that scandal. Therefore, I'm quite convinced that this crisis, which is of course very tragic in many ways, will help in terms of increasing health sector budgets and improving the priority of the health sector among all in a big way. Second thing which I found works is the good ideas. If you can come up with good ideas, Obviously, politicians, policymakers love to be associated with the success. And if there are good ideas that you can present to them in terms of policies, that helps. Third thing that I found was champions, that if you can, there are a couple of champions we can work with, either they're at political level or high level of policy, that helps. And finally, nothing succeeds like success. If you can show some success in terms of your implementation, and if your programs are doing well, I think it is always easier for anyone to provide more resources. Right now, coming to your question about how do we sustain or ensure that financing for health sector remains, what we are seeing in India is that our funding for health is not going down. Actually, of course, it's a zero-sum game, and total pie has shrunk. Economies has gone down, and I'm not a macroeconomist, so I will not say when it is going to be back. But what people say is that it's here to stay for some more time. And if the total pie has gone down, then even if the taxation rate remains the same, our revenues will be smaller. And it's a zero-sum game. So if we retain the share of health sector, everything else, something else has to go down. And that is a tough call countries have to make. But for the time being, since COVID and health is at the center of policy debate right now, and people are worried about this, and also many of the fault lines have been exposed in the health sector. Budget for the health sector has not been reduced. Of course, there are economy measures which are in place, that you will not organize big meetings, you will not fill positions, but those are across the board. But in terms of hard money, it has not been taken away. But this is a temporary thing. This is an opportunity that health sector has to pounce on, because right now it is very high on policy debate. It would have been much more difficult, say 6 months ago, to convince your policymakers to increase or budget for health. Now is the time when everyone is convinced, and they've seen that if health shock comes, everything else also stops. And we've seen that world coming to standstill because of a health shock, and that message will be here for I think a generation to come. So I think, but to ensure that we continue to have this funding, continue to have greater funding, we first of all need to ensure that we very effectively and efficiently use this budget, and we have to show results out of what resources, expanded resources, health sector has received so far. At the same time, we have to ensure that other diseases are not forgotten. It's not only COVID or communicable diseases. Right now, country and the world indeed is going through this double, and some people say triple burden of disease, including injuries. And therefore, it has to be a comprehensive response where we can ensure that budget is equally or proportionately distributed among various health priorities. And finally, we have to also ensure that poor people and women and disadvantaged are not discriminated against in terms of financing, and we make sure that equity aspects of financing is also taken care of. Therefore, what I sincerely believe is that COVID, while it's a huge crisis and huge tragedy, is a great opportunity for the health sector to establish itself as one of the premier major development areas and sector. And here it's a, I think, burden of proof is on us to show that with the greater resources, or the relatively greater resources, we can deliver and ensure more healthier but also prosperous world to our citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bhushan, for your time. And I really liked your 4 tips or 4 success factors for being convincing towards Ministry of Finance. And I took very much note of that. And I completely agree that disruptive shocks can actually have a positive effect sometimes. Thank you so much for your time. We are running 5 minutes late, so I just wanted to give an outlook what's going to happen after our coffee break. And after the coffee break, we will divide all participants into 5 groups. Each group will have a moderator, and we're going to show you on a slide who they are. And in this breakout sessions, we will talk in smaller groups about the budget outlook in countries in the region, as well as talk about how we as a community can make the case for sustained financing. The time will be very short, maximum 30 minutes, but I think a lot of people can engage either by actually speaking and also, like you do already, make heavy use of the chat box. So I just wanted to tell you who our moderators are. They will be waiting after the coffee break for you. Peter Corley, Dr. Suzanne Roth, I just quoted. She's a senior health expert, but also the principal knowledge sharing and services specialist at the ADB. Sarah Fuhr is with us. She's the co-director for evidence to policy initiative of the Global Health Group at the University of California in San Francisco, and actually the key organizer for this session, Patrick Silborn, the head for external relations of Appelmar, and myself, I will take also one group. So you're gonna hear a video in the coffee break. When this video stops, it's time to be back at your seat so you don't miss the big track to the 5 breakout rooms. We allocate you all. So there will be a link appearing on your screen afterwards. So it's important that you are back on time. So when the videos, when they start, you know that there will be only 4 minutes left. So we're gonna allocate now in the coffee break everybody to a group. And before I do that, one more time to all our speakers in the first session, Lisa Robbins, Peter Corley, Susie Pereira, and Dr. Indu Bhushan. Thank you so much for joining us for the first part, and come back. The second part will be very interactive, and we had a lot of good feedback yesterday when we had a similar breakout. So please be back on time. Thank you very much, and refresh yourself. It will be approximately a 6-minute break, not much longer or shorter. So please be ready to come back after maybe you refresh yourself with a coffee or tea. Thank you for the moment. And of course, in the meantime, you can also make use of the chat box and share your thoughts and insights. And so for the people who are online, behind the scene, we are preparing the breakout session, and the time warning will be 2 videos we're going to show. We show actually every day. One is on the impact of climate change on malaria elimination, and the second one, the relationship between gender norms and malaria elimination. 2 very interesting videos, 4 minutes long together, so you know when they finish, it's time to be back at the seat. And for people who have to leave, thank you very much. Dr. Anupong, I saw he has to leave, Kafu Makrab. And so hope many of you can stay for the second half. We need your collective knowledge, and it will feed into our SOM meeting on Friday. Thank you so much. Okay, welcome back. I give everybody maybe a minute or two to come back. So may I request all our breakout session moderators to switch on their cameras so that our colleagues can get already a visual of you. Dr. Suzanne, Dr. Patrick Silborn, Dr. Peter Colley, and Sarah. So I have to decrease my screen so I can see you all. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And everybody else, please switch off your camera. But you will be able to switch on your camera and your audio in the breakout. So we are moving now in a minute from now into breakouts. You will be more or less in equally sized groups with a mix of government official colleagues and from other organizations. We have approximately 25 minutes, but I think we have a good number. So hopefully many of you can actually talk. The Chatham rules will apply. As you know, under the Chatham House rules, anyone who comes to a meeting is free to use information from the discussion, but you are not allowed to reveal who made the comment. So some of our colleagues might say some internal data. So please be aware of that. Issues. One is the budget outlook in the represented countries, making the case for sustained financing. And if there are cuts to financing, what is the right course of action? And that's my favorite question, the way forward. So we're looking forward to hearing from you, and make use of the chat box as well as try to grab the mic, but be aware of time budget. Not everybody can probably speak. And if you speak, make sure you keep it to the point, but your moderator is there to guide you. So let me ask if we are ready to go. If you're ready to go, you should see a link any moment on your screen. Please click on it and you will go in one of our 5 breakout rooms. So I see the first people leaving. I hope you're all back. There will be one Appelmar colleague staying in the plenary to guide you in case you are lost. I will also now leave for room 5 and enjoy the conversation. Okay, so the last minutes, we just gonna have a quick wrap up, and I want to ask you for 2-3 minutes max debriefs. However, if there are any key messages that you feel that are missing or you want to underline, everybody feel free to write into the chat. And I will start with Dr. Suzanne, because she came late, so she has to start first. She had the longest time to discuss.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see the slide. Can you see the slide that I'm sharing with the notes?
Yes, we can see it, Suzanne.
Okay, so I will increase. So yeah, it was an active discussion. I think we heard from many participants. Number one, what we see is we are moving to more integration, and to some extent this could be also positive. We are prioritizing key activities and integrating at the community level to better integrated and coordinated community health services. Needs to continue. But what we also said is the government and development partners need to also fund these integrated community services. So this means we need to have more support for decentralized funding and for integration at the community level, and to sustain at the community level then these malaria elimination activities. And we need to have then also funding to be able to make better targeted and also geographically targeted interventions. There was an interesting discussion about we need development partners in the global community to sustain the activities across borders. This is really important. And I think one very important point was, which we can really see in so many areas, it's not just money that needs to be provided. It's really also about improving networks at the practitioners level to find solutions together, to share what the challenges are, and to innovate in a way under funding constrained environments. And this is what we don't see enough. We do see high-level, more political networks. The development partners don't really integrate them because they need to check their boxes that they delivered another website, another workshop, another platform. So this needs to change because we are wasting resources also from the development partners through this. And of course, we all agreed malaria elimination efforts need to continue. We cannot let the guard down, and we need all of us to advocate for it and to be more efficient and achieve more results by innovating and collaborating. Over.
Thank you very much for this excellent and detailed summary, and already in writing, perfect. Thank you, Dr. Suzanne Roth, for moderating your group. And I will go over to Sarah Fewer. So Sarah, over to you. What happened in your group?
Just unmute myself and I have a messy slide deck. So let me just pull this up. All right, can you see that?
Yes, but you have to increase the size. Yes, thank you very much.
There we go. Okay, so for the first question around the budget outlook in various countries, well, we heard that in general, a lot of that there was a sense that the external funding for malaria activities, malaria drugs and diagnostics and LLINs were protected. I think that those were not impacted right now, but that COVID-19 with some of the impact and potential savings, I guess, that funding had been reprogrammed for COVID. We heard that in Pakistan, we're seeing a continued, I guess, low priority of health and not necessarily a change in that, and a lot of need on the ground to address the lack of basic healthcare facilities for the COVID response, but also for the malaria response. In Indonesia, we heard that the priority is really focused on COVID, but there is still progress on malaria vaccine research. And in Myanmar, we heard that the external funding has been increasing. The health budget overall has been increasing in the years, but there was a sense that planning ahead, we needed to focus on strengthening domestic resources. And this brings us into the second question that was on what we can do to ensure sustained financing for health and especially for malaria. The bottom bullets capture an interesting part of the conversation that we only got to at the end and in the chat, but around this need to strengthen domestic financing, not reduce reliance on external financing, and to prepare sustainability plans and strategies for countries to exit and transition away from external financing. There was a sense that many countries in the region are not prepared for that. Many participants also highlighted the need for a multi-sector approach, and particularly the role of the private sector. Some examples were given from, I guess, like earlier on, but like, years ago, just on public, private, and civil society approaches. And then also the potential of addressing out-of-pocket expenditures and how that can, what the effects that can be on malaria spending, and also this responsibility of governments and ministries of health in pandemic preparedness to ensure drugs are in stock. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure my last slide, I don't think I really captured it well here. So this is just my notes as a template, but a very interesting conversation.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And you had anyhow a documenter in your room. I think they will add on what you have just said. Thank you for this excellent presentation, Sarah. And I would like to go actually to Patrick. Patrick, what happened in your group?
Thanks, Joss. So I have a slide, but I don't know if it doesn't add much, I think, to a lot of the conversations that I've already mentioned were also mentioned in our group. We talked a bit about the challenging fiscal situation that COVID-19 has led to, and also the fact that the social distancing also has had an impact on the programs. Case finding in many countries are, for example, down. What we also talked about the importance of making the case for continued malaria and health financing, and also what that meant. We had Reini Shimoto from Japan, who suggested that we need to that there's strong data from WHO, for example, that the highlights that if we take our eyes on malaria, the disease will come roaring back, of course. We also heard from others that we need to sustain the political commitment, especially in Vietnam, where they have a malaria plan and budget that has been helpful to demonstrate that there is a commitment here in actually continue funding malaria. We need to show results. I think this is something that's come up many times. Show results, programmatic results, but also the fact in the results in how the money is being spent, that we spend the money wisely. And finally, a comment from the Global Fund was that we need to make sure that we use the funding effectively. If we can't use the funding that's available to us, then it will be very, very hard to ask ministers of finance for more money. So that was sort of an appeal as well to programs to make sure that we do everything we can to spend money as effectively as possible. Over.
Okay, and then the next person I would like to call upon on Ritika Datta for Group 5.
Thanks, Jost. So there's not much to add in terms of what extra was discussed in breakout room 5, and I do not have a slide as such. But however, some of the important things which came up was it's as important as ever to maintain the political commitment towards malaria elimination. And in some of the countries, we've heard that the research activities are getting hampered. Well, the impact is not huge as of yet. But if this situation continues, then research grants for the next year are getting seriously hampered, and that's a priority. There's also talk about advocating for sufficient and sustained resources for malaria interventions. And one of the most important thing which came up was prioritizing community strengthening activities in these countries so that we don't fall back on the gains that we've achieved so far. And another important point raised was the option to explore different alternative resource mobilization mechanisms. We've also heard from countries such as Myanmar, where I think each of the ministry had to donate 10% from their health budgets to a COVID fund. But how that will impact malaria elimination activities is something that can be seen in the near term, I believe. We've also heard from WHO MME, where they follow up the situation in all of the countries that in all of the Mekong countries that we are working in. They're taking stock of drugs, they're taking stock of commodities, and also the number of cases in order to see if COVID has had any impact on the malaria services and commodities. So I think that's it from my side. Thanks, Jost.
Thank you very much, Ritika, for helping out. And last but not least, I hand over to the chair, Peter Cawley, and also ask him to not only summarize, but also close the meeting. I just wanted to remind everybody that when Peter is finished, we will show a slide with a small poll. We would like to get your feedback. So if you can stay another 3-4 minutes online, it would be wonderful. Thank you very much. Peter, over to you.
Great. Just make sure. Okay. I just wanted to thank everyone yet again, and just had a very simple slide here about some of the takeaways from all 3 questions. We had a very spirited discussion, and remembering that malaria budgets in certain countries were under pressure even prior to COVID-19. And this comes from as malaria starts to become towards the end of elimination. It's difficult to find appropriate budgets because people don't see the impact of malaria. It's almost a lose-lose situation in that the closer you get to elimination, it's harder to keep your budgets up because you don't see much malaria around. And that was an excellent point. The other point is around some of the competing pressures that malaria budgets will more than likely face, even besides the decline in government revenue, is COVID vaccination is probably right around the corner. And this will have an impact on Ministry of Health budgets. We know that we've already started to see some of the impact from COVID-19 as well as pandemic preparedness measures. But with the addition of the more than likely addition of COVID-19 vaccination on already strained budgets will have an effect, and it will have an effect on more than likely on on subsector components of the malaria budget. There was also the private sector has been identified as upping their game and upping their contribution through corporate social responsibility. Especially in certain countries in the region, malaria is still a threat around dams, around hydroelectric and mining. If you're digging there and you're building the dam, you have some responsibility, and this can help take off some of the pressure on scarce government revenue. But remembering that some of the prospective private sector partners are also suffering from the economic consequences of COVID-19. Mm-hmm. The standard argument, that we've heard before, you take your foot off the gas from malaria, we know what happens. It's documented, and it comes back with a vengeance. And as Minister Pereira had mentioned, it's difficult and expensive to get it back to where it was before. Other speakers have mentioned integration. During times of fiscal stress, Ministry of Finance will be looking for every penny, shilling, rupee it can get its hands on. And it will be looking for areas in which there's waste. And when there are vertical programs that are non-integrated, that's waste. Another very interesting point was, be at the ready. With various different scenarios, budget scenarios. There's the fiscal picture for next year, as I'd mentioned earlier, from the Ministry of Finance perspective, is confusing because they won't know what their revenue targets will be with a great certainty like they do in previous years because of the disruption in the economy. The Ministry of Finance will be looking for flexibility in terms of its revenue and expenditure. They will be more than likely using different scenarios, A, B, and C, depending on where the economy is going. And it's probably a good idea that the health sector, as well as the subsector malaria, has version A, version B, and version C. Don't just necessarily stick to one. The other one, which is an excellent point, is that within the subsector budget there are certain things that are redlined. And what I mean by redlined is untouchable. Do not mess with this. Do not. And in particular, among that is surveillance and the drug pipelines. Again, these are in interaction with Global Fund as well as with national budgets. In worst case scenario, training can be delayed. Capital, there's not much capital for malaria, but whatever there is, that can be delayed. But there's certain components within it, and again, this is something that Dr. Pereira had alluded to, that do not touch, and or it will come back and be with a vengeance, and in particular surveillance, and keeping the drug pipelines and the commodity pipelines open.
Okay.
Again, I'd like to thank everyone. Even though the breakout group was quite short, I personally learned a lot and got my pen out, and I rarely do that. But it was fascinating. And again, I'd like to thank the host and fellow presenters for their contribution. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Peter. And before we close the meeting, I want to call upon actually the CEO of Appelmar, Jeffrey Smith. He's actually the one who coordinates the whole Malaria Week and keeps us all together. We are halfway through. Jeff, any insights and an outlook for the last 2 remaining days would be nice.
Thanks, Joost. Yeah, we're halfway through Malaria Week, and it's been a good 3 meetings so far, and we're looking forward to another 2. I want to emphasize how important the discussions that we've had today and the previous 2 days are. It provides a great deal of valuable information. It allows us to, understand what the country's challenges are and where they need additional support. We hear firsthand from the government officials and from the partners around that. I think, the platform provides an opportunity for APOMA and APMIN and all of the partners in the region who are supporting the countries to understand what the priority needs are and then try to help the countries to address those. So now that we're in the middle of Malaria Week, a much condensed Malaria Week than we're used to, but we've still tried to maintain a convergent platform. And by that, I mean, early in the week, we talk about the technical and the operational challenges. We let the programs, the malaria programs, tell us what they're having challenges with and how we move forward in addressing them. And then we get a bit more granular as we move through the week. So yesterday we were talking about surveillance and reporting. Today is on sustaining financing for health and malaria elimination in particular. And tomorrow we'll talk about innovation and PVIVAX. But all of this will culminate at the senior officials meeting on Friday, where we hope to distill all of the key messages that come out of these days into discussions on Friday that will lead to collective action. So we'll share the points that were raised today with the senior officials on Friday, certainly highlighting the importance of sustained financing for health and in particular malaria, and then try to translate that into advocacy and real policies through a call for action that will come out of Friday's meeting. So I hope that helps explain the pathway to getting to Friday and the senior officials meeting. And I just want to thank everyone for their participation in today's meeting. Thanks, Joost.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And so that's it for today. We're going to show the exit poll. Please be so kind to fill it out. It takes only less than a minute. It will appear on your screen any second. And while you're leaving, don't forget tomorrow, Malaria Game Changers Innovation Series. Jeff mentioned it. So I hope many of you have registered and will join. And thanks again to all speakers today, our chairs, our moderators for the breakout, and of course to all of you, all participants who have actively participated. Thank you very much. Stay safe, stay healthy. And the chat box is open. We keep the call as usual, 5 minutes more open. So any feedback, any qualitative comments you want to add to our discussion, please do so. We're going to save the chat box in 5 minutes from now. Otherwise, you can log off when you are finished with the exit poll and take a good rest. For some, it's evening. For some, it's lunchtime. So for some, it might be even a very weird time if you log in from the United States or from Latin America. So refresh yourself. See you tomorrow for the next session. Thank you very much.